Hello, and welcome to the channel. Today I want to attack one of the scariest subjects in your first semester or block of anatomy, which is
the brachial plexus.
The brachial plexus is one of my all-time favorite subjects, but every year, this is always presented as the worst lecture.
This lecture's gonna ruin your life.
Worst subject.
Get out while you still can.
We're gonna hate it.
I'd rather drink gasoline than learn about the brachial plexus.
When it really isn't as bad as they say. My goal with this series is to prove to you that you can learn anything when you know how to organize it. So we are going to break down the brachial plexus, starting with the words themselves. Brachial is a Latin word for arm, and in our case, it's referring to the entire upper limb, shoulder, arm, forearm, and hand, which a lot of us probably for most of our lives refer to as the arm instead of the upper limb, but that's how we're going to talk about it now. Plexus means network, and the actual translation is braid or plait if you're across the pond. So I like to think of the brachial plexus as many nerves, which are just bundles of neurons, braided together, then divided apart to be braided together again in a new and different way. This nerve plexus then provides innervation, or control, of the entire upper limb. Innervation is the term we use to describe the function of nerves, which is to communicate something, whether that something is motor innervation, which can be thought of as the stimulation of a muscle contraction, or sensory innervation, which is the process of feeling something, allowing you to interact with your external and internal environment. This plexus provides innervation, both sensory and motor, to the entirety of the upper limb. Here's why it seems like a huge, overwhelming deal the day you get this lecture. At this point in your academics, you have most likely, depending on your curriculum, learned back, shoulder, and chest. Up till now, you've been memorizing which nerves innervate which muscles, and you haven't seen their origin, but it hasn't been a problem. Today, you meet their maker. But that's not the overwhelming part. It's not overwhelming because you already are familiar with those nerves' names and functions, so you're just adding one piece of information, which is where they came from. The overwhelming part is the learning of the new nerves that branch from this plexus, the main nerves that branch from this plexus and innervate all the muscles and all the skin patches you haven't heard of yet. At the end of your axilla and brachial plexus lecture, you are left with so much information, all of which is new to the tips of the fingers, and that's terrifying. But here's what you should know, and what you should take some sort of respite in. That lecture is an outline of the next 5 to 6 lectures that you're going to get in this block. It's a preview, an overview. It is not the end. So let me teach you how to treat this lecture like the outline that it really is, and give you the tools you need to be successful, less stressful, and maybe even enjoy the subject that you worked your ass off to get the opportunity to learn about. So let's get into it. The brachial plexus is a nerve network made up of 5 roots, which are, yes, in quotations, we'll talk about that combine into 3 trunks, divide into 6 divisions, recombine into 3 chords, and finally divide into 5 branches.
5, 3, 6, 3, 5.
It's a palindrome, if you will. Why do I have roots in quotations? Because I want you to take note that the roots we talk about in the brachial plexus are a misnomer. They aren't really roots, except in the sense of them being metaphorical roots off a metaphorical tree that is the brachial plexus. In reality, these roots are really anterior or ventral spinal rami from the spinal level C5 through T1. Don't remember what those are? Well, you're in luck. I'm going to remind you. This is an image of an axial, aka horizontal, aka transverse cross-section through the spinal cord between the levels of C5 to T1 for our purposes. I'm going to walk you through some of the structures as a reminder so you can understand what the brachial plexus is truly made of. However, if this explanation doesn't cut it for you and you're finding you need a deeper, more thorough explanation or review of the nervous system as a whole, you're in luck. That video is currently under construction. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss it when it comes out. Also, feel free to comment so I know which topics you want to see next and can make those a priority. So the brain and the spinal cord are our central nervous system, and the parts that look like little hands and arms grabbing onto the slice of central nervous system that we have in this picture are actually the peripheral nervous system. So let's review some of those parts. If you know this stuff already, just skip past this and start at the next part. First, let's establish what's dorsal or posterior in this picture and what's ventral or anterior in this picture, color coding them blue and pink. So dorsal is at the top of the slide and ventral is more of the bottom half of the slide. That means the upper portion of the gray matter of the spinal cord is the dorsal horn, whereas this lower portion would be the ventral horn for us. Creating one of the connections from CNS to PNS is the ventral root that comes directly from the ventral horn. The ventral horn and root are comprised 100% of motor neurons. The cell bodies of these motor neurons exist in the ventral horn, while the axons of those neurons make up the ventral root. The key being the ventral aspect, the root, the horn, is 100% motor. This is in direct contrast to the dorsal root and dorsal horn, which are comprised of 100% sensory neurons. On the dorsal aspect, there's also a new feature called the dorsal root ganglion. A little vocabulary review. Ganglia are collections of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, whereas collections of cell bodies in the central nervous system are referred to as gray matter or nuclei. So it's just a little vocabulary difference, but both are collections of cell bodies. So the dorsal root ganglion is a collection of sensory neuron cell bodies that exist outside of the central nervous system, in the peripheral nervous system, due to the actual shape of a typical sensory neuron, which is considered pseudo-unipolar, meaning the cell body isn't always at the start or the end of the neuron, but can actually be somewhere in the middle of the axon. So sensory neurons bring signals to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, which either synapses on another sensory neuron in that dorsal horn of the spinal cord to communicate with the brain, or more commonly, like during a reflex, will synapse on what's called an interneuron that will communicate directly with a motor neuron in the ventral horn at the same level to cause a quick reflexive reaction that will send a signal out through the ventral horn, through the ventral root, and into a mixed spinal nerve and its branches that we have not discussed yet, to then move your hand because you touched a hot stove. The main point being that dorsal root is all sensory neurons, ventral root is all motor neurons, and when they are running together in a sheath, we will call that a mixed spinal nerve due to its dual function. Those mixed spinal nerves then branch either towards the dorsal surface, posteriorly, or towards the ventral surface, anteriorly. The word for branch in Latin is rami. So dorsal rami are just mixed spinal nerve branches that happen to branch in a dorsal direction. Ventral rami are the branches of a mixed spinal nerve that happen to branch in a ventral direction. The brachial plexus,
Oh my god, it took her this long to get here?
is made up of 5 ventral rami, not ventral roots, which can be really confusing when we call them roots of the brachial plexus. But now you know roots really means ventral rami.
What the hell is that?
This is an image of a brachial plexus bilaterally, so both sides. The stars depict our ventral rami that are exiting the vertebral column to run out laterally from the neck towards the upper limb. In lab, you can't see the central nervous system unless you break through the spinal column and cut into the dural coverings, but I included it in this image so you can appreciate the relationship. The brachial plexus then combines and divides and combines and divides, and we are going to learn its specific parts now. Alright, so our brachial plexus is organized into roots, which are really ventral rami, trunks, divisions, cords, and branches. How do I remember that order? When I think about the brachial plexus, all I want to do is run to drink cold beer. And if you don't drink beer, you could just say beverages. To remind me of the roots, trunks, divisions, cords, and branches, as well as the beer you deserve once you complete this lecture. Let's put it into practice. We run, don't walk, with our 5 roots, aka ventral rami, of spinal levels C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. C meaning cervical, T meaning thoracic. Those 5 roots then combine into 3 trunks, superior, middle, and inferior, sometimes referred to as upper, middle, and lower. Specifically, the C5 and C6 roots become the superior trunk, the C7 continues, changes name, and becomes the middle trunk, and the C8 and T1 roots combine into the inferior trunk. Then the trunks all divide into 6 divisions, as each trunk is going to give off 1 anterior and 1 posterior division. Those anterior and posterior divisions will recombine in a new way to create 3 cords. The 2 anterior divisions from the superior and middle trunks combine into the lateral cord. All the posterior divisions combine to form the posterior cord. Finally, the leftover anterior division from the inferior trunk becomes the medial cord. Those cords then divide one last time to form the 5 main nerve branches that the brachial plexus creates. These nerves have unique names and are made up of neurons from different roots, aka different spinal levels, in different combinations. The lateral cord gives rise to the musculocutaneous nerve. The posterior cord has 2 branches, the axillary nerve and the radial nerve. The lateral and medial cord give contributions to form the median nerve. And lastly, the medial cord gives off the ulnar nerve. But I know how complicated that looks, so we are going to learn how to draw everything I just talked about in 30 seconds. Let's go. You are going to draw 2 parallel horizontal Ys, leaving generous space in between. Then you are going to add a third Y in between the first 2 in the opposite direction. At this point, you have 3 alternating Ys. Between the top and middle Y, draw an X. Between the middle and bottom Y, draw a slash. Then at the end of the Ys, connecting the top and the bottom Y's ends, draw the sum sign. Yes, the one from math class that looks a bit like a strange E. And you've done it, the brachial plexus in 30 seconds. And now some tips to remember the drawing since I'm not being timed. If an X and a slash don't make sense, and if you happen to like bowling, think of how a strike in bowling, which is hitting all the pins down in one go, is depicted with an X. Strikes are better than spares, which is when you hit all the pins down but it took you 2 tries, and that's depicted in bowling as a slash, half of an X. Because strikes are better than spares, the X is on top. Or you can just memorize the X and the slash. But if you like bowling, I think it helps. If the sum sign doesn't work for you, think about it as a sideways M, or an arrowhead, or whatever works for you so that you can remember how to do this drawing. That's what really matters. What works for me, what works for you may be different, but being able to draw this quickly will benefit everyone when you study. Because now that I can draw it, I can study its parts by labeling my drawing. Here's my roots, C5, C6, C7, C8, T1, 3 trunks, superior, middle, inferior, 3 anterior divisions, 3 posterior divisions, making 6 total. Then we combine into 3 chords, the lateral, posterior, and medial chord, and finally 5 branches. The musculocutaneous nerve from the lateral chord, the axillary and radial nerves from the posterior chord, the lateral chord and the medial chord contributions to form the median nerve, and lastly, the medial chord giving off the ulnar nerve. Drawing this plexus out and labeling the drawing will help you learn its structure and also gives you the unique ability to draw this on your scratch paper for your written exam or quickly doodle for your practical. Whatever the case is, I can guarantee starting to learn the brachial plexus by drawing it out will only benefit you as you learn more and more about it. Now, we just learned the roots to the branches, but the reality for most of you will be that the roots, trunks, divisions only exist on your written exam, and the practical, if you have one, will focus much more on the chords and branches, unless of course your professors are having a horrendous day and they're going to take it out on you. So for lab, I recommend landmarks because they truly help the most, and all you need is to be able to identify one part of this plexus consistently, and you are golden to figure out the rest. One of those landmarks is the anatomical M, which is actually the portion that I called the sum sign earlier when we were drawing it, made up of the musculocutaneous nerve laterally, the ulnar nerve medially, and the medial and lateral contributions that make up the median nerve in the center. This forms an M called the anatomical M. And while this is a good landmark, it is not the best landmark. Why? Well, to be frank, sometimes it don't look so good. It looks a little wonky, if you will. Something like this, instead of a regular M. When people rely on the M being the shape of an M, they usually get lost when they are in the lab. So what do you need? You need a second landmark, a backup landmark that you always use when identifying this one. And that, for me, is the musculocutaneous nerve. Because, and I know we haven't talked about this yet, it is the most consistent looking nerve in lab because no matter what, it always branches into the anterior arm muscles. 90% of the time, which is a made-up statistic, most of the time, the musculocutaneous nerve pierces a muscle called the coracobrachialis, which is high up on the arm. So I look for a big nerve heading straight into a muscle in the anterior arm compartment. That tells me that's musculocutaneous nerve. Then I can take that musculocutaneous nerve and trace back to find the lateral cord, which then I can trace out to find the median nerve by tracking along that lateral contribution. Once I find the median nerve, then I've found the middle of my anatomical M and can trace up to find my medial cord, which then I can trace down to find my ulnar nerve. So by me establishing a pattern and a system that is every time I try to identify parts of the brachial plexus, I'm going to look for the musculocutaneous nerve first, and then I'm going to ID it by seeing it going to the anterior arm muscles. Then I am set up for successfully finding the anatomical M by tracing and can find and identify everything else. Landmarks like the ones we just discussed are incredibly useful to you when you draw things out to study, since essentially you're making a mental map when you draw things out, and then you are utilizing that map to identify things in the lab and to answer questions in lecture. A lot of you listening to this will say things like, I don't draw, or I can't draw, or others of you will think this takes too long, and this is when I want to remind you how we drew it in 30 seconds, and I believe with practice you can draw it in 10. Then after you have laid a solid foundation, you add to and build upon these drawings by putting in destinations and landmarks, all of which I can go into greater detail in the compartmentalization video that follows this one. So moving right along. The other takeaway I would like to give you is that I want to point out the anatomical M's position in relationship to the axillary artery, which is the main artery in the axilla, aka the anatomical term for armpit, which is where we are seeing these cords and branches. So the axillary artery is positioned deep to the anatomical M, which means the portions of the brachial plexus that make up the anatomical M are on top of, superficial to, the axillary artery. The axillary artery, while deep to the anatomical M structures, is superficial to the posterior cord and its branches, meaning you can't see them unless you move it out of the way. In fact, the axillary artery can be one of your landmarks in this area since it is the reason for the naming of the cords. The lateral cord is lateral to the axillary artery, the medial cord is medial to this artery, and the posterior cord is deep to this artery, hence the names. Okay, so my first confession comes now. I told you earlier we drew the whole brachial plexus, and we did draw the meat of it, but here are the potatoes. There are 11 other branches that come off the brachial plexus, but the great thing about these 11 branches is that you know 9 of them already. They are well familiar to you, and there's only 2 that are new. I'm going to organize these 11 by where they branch from. We have 2 other branches off the roots of our brachial plexus. Specifically, C5 gives off a branch we already know. That is the dorsal scapular nerve. See? It's not so bad. We know this one. We also know the long thoracic nerve from our chest lecture, and now we know that that nerve is actually made up of neurons from C5, C6, and C7. Scapulas point to heaven when this nerve is injured. It's a fun way to remember it. So first 2 are off the roots. The second 2 are actually off the superior trunk. Branch number 3 of 11 is the suprascapular nerve that innervates the supra and infraspinatus. The 4th is the nerve to subclavius. If you haven't figured it out yet, that nerve innervates the subclavius muscle. Shade thrown. For the rest of the extra nerves, I'm going to split up the extra branches by which cord they branch from. So the lateral cord gives off 1 extra branch called the lateral pectoral nerve. You can probably guess where the medial pectoral nerve branches from, but we're not going to jump ahead and get there yet. The posterior cord and the medial cord will actually both give off 3 extra branches. The posterior cord gives off the upper subscapular, the middle subscapular, also known as the thoracodorsal, and the lower subscapular nerve, all in a row. The medial cord is going to give off the medial pectoral nerve, which I want to take a second to acknowledge the connection between medial and lateral pectoral nerves that you can see in this picture. This is called the ansa pectoralis and exists in some but not all bodies. This is one of many examples of learn what you're taught in lecture for your tests, but know that some of that information just may not be true. No, I don't mean your professors are lying to you. What I mean is bodies are variable. So in lecture, you learned that the medial pectoral nerve pokes through the pec minor to get to the pec major and therefore innervates both the pec minor and pec major, while the lateral pectoral nerve is going to just innervate pec major. But in reality, if they're connected to one another, they're going to innervate both. This is not your invitation to go yell at your lecturer, but is one of those moments to appreciate how everyone is similar but uniquely different. You may have an ansa pectoralis in your body, and I may not. But no one knows, and the average population seems to have the innervations described by your professors in lecture. Therefore, you can learn a rule like pec minor is innervated by medial pectoral nerve, and pec major is innervated by both medial and lateral pectoral nerve. But know in the back of your mind that this just isn't true for everyone. And that, my friends, is the beauty of anatomy. Returning to our final branches, which happen to be the new ones, these branches come off the medial cord and have medial in the name. They are the medial brachial cutaneous nerve and the medial antebrachial cutaneous nerve. So let's break down those names real quick. Brachial means arm. Antebrachial, therefore, means before arm, aka forearm. Cutaneous is another word for skin, so these nerves are cutaneous nerves, sensory nerves, that provide skin innervation from the medial aspect of the arm, medial brachial cutaneous, and the medial aspect of the forearm, medial antebrachial cutaneous. I didn't always know that, but a quick Google search of the word cutaneous will tell you it means skin, and sometimes that makes all the difference when you're learning something new. We are good at drawing the brachial plexus now, so we're going to add these extra branches to our drawing to practice where they come from, where they go, where they come from, Cotton Eye Joe. 2 branches from the roots, dorsal scapular and long thoracic, C5, C6, C7, scapulas to heaven. If you didn't get that yet, it's a reference to wing scapula, the patient presentation when the long thoracic nerve is injured, and the serratus anterior is not holding the scapula into the body wall like it's supposed to. Like you have wings, like you should go to heaven. 2 branches from the superior trunk, suprascapular nerve and nerve to subclavius. 1 branch from the lateral cord, that is the lateral pectoral nerve, 3 branches from the posterior cord, the upper and lower subscapular nerves, and the middle subscapular nerve, which was renamed thoracodorsal nerve, which we all know and love because it was one of our first nerves we ever learned. Finally, 3 branches from our medial cord, which include the medial pectoral nerve, medial brachial cutaneous, and medial antebrachial cutaneous nerves. And that is the whole brachial plexus. We practice labeling the main stuff, then we add the extra branches as we go, and when we get really good at this basic naming and this drawing's easy for us, we venture forward and we add more information to this drawing as we learn it. For some, the next logical step is adding in the muscles and the skin that these nerves connect to and innervate so that we can start to practice that part. But as we get good at associating these muscles and parts of the skin to these nerves that innervate them, then we should go a step further, maybe start to add function as we draw this out. And then when we are that expert walking around the lab that everybody can't figure out why we know the things we know because they haven't seen this video yet, but you should tell them, don't be a gatekeeper, you can actually use this basic drawing to start practicing for your lecture exam. Just start crossing things out and start thinking through what would happen, how would that patient present if this part of this nerve or this nerve was injured. I'll give 2 examples. If you damage your long thoracic nerve, depending on the type of damage, the serratus anterior muscle is either weakened by a damaged nerve or paralyzed by a ruptured nerve. That's a nerve that is completely torn. What does that look like? Well, if the serratus anterior's job is to protract the scapula and stabilize it by holding it into the body wall, the patient won't be able to do those things at all or will struggle immensely with those things. Hence, winging of the scapula with a long thoracic nerve injury. A different injury occurs when we completely tear a brachial plexus root. It's sometimes called an avulsion when we do this, which just means complete tear. So in our image, we can see C5 is crossed out, and that means that any nerve on this drawing that C5 contributes neurons to would be affected by this injury. And you would actually need to know which of the nerve branches of this plexus have C5 neurons in them, which is something we will look at in a separate video I'm calling Advanced Brachial Plexus. The point being, you can use these drawings for more than you think. Your lecture exam questions concerning this topic will most likely give you examples of injuries, and you will work backwards to figure out what those injuries are caused by, damage to which nerve. Because you know the schematic and have practiced it, you will be absolutely fine. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you can see the next video that I'm releasing where I'm going to walk you through how to organize the functions of the main brachial plexus nerve branches. Toodles!